Let's dive right in. So, the agenda for today, I'll be talking about really what constitutes business email compromise. I imagine most people on the call are very familiar. It's been in the IC3 report from the FBI pretty consistently over the past, the 3 years I've been at Abnormal. We'll talk about some of the threats we've discovered recently in this realm, and then I'll show a demo of an attack that we've uncovered and how Abnormal would stop it. And then, obviously, from there, we'll take some questions. So, diving in first and foremost, what is business email compromise? I'm not going to make everyone read all the text on this slide, and I personally am not going to read it at you. I read my daughter enough books every night as it is, but I will talk at a high level, obviously, about BEC for those who might be unfamiliar or at least want to get our perspective on it. So when we talk about business email compromise, we're talking about oftentimes payloadless attacks, um, typically tailored at uh, getting some sort of financial gain, getting rather than breaking into the organization, trying to commit fraud in some way is what we see more often than not. And I'll show you that in the examples that we have. The interesting thing about business email compromise, though, is how it's been empowered by AI, as you see here. So, with the advent of generative AI, whether those are publicly available legitimate models or malicious models, attackers are using those today to really supercharge their ability to create these types of convincing social engineering attacks at scale. Now, we're seeing that through groups like Scattered Spider and some of the other nation state threat actors that are coming out, and just the sheer amount of sophisticated emails that they can send out to high value targets in a given time period. The reason for that, obviously, is they're not just using AI to create the emails themselves, but to do the research on these individuals as well. In the past, for an attacker, it might take 40 hours to create an OSINT report, going out and looking at the social media for a target, looking at other publicly available data, taking all of that, trying to create a convincing email based on an understanding of that person, and it's done at human speed. So you can really accomplish maybe creating a few of those with enough resourcing for high value targets. But now what an attacker can do, unfortunately, is take that AI, scrape publicly available sources for hundreds of folks all at once, correlate all of that information, and create super targeted attacks that'll be sent out to each of those individuals in kind that look like a legitimate email they'd get from a known sender. Now, the impact obviously has been that these attacks are incredibly difficult to discern. And because they often don't include a payload, they can be difficult to detect with traditional tools like secure email gateways, because you can't really write a policy or a rule around uh, a change in sender tone or formatting. And then obviously the defense against these, and I'll show you what we can do at Abnormal, is to be able to detect those subtle changes to behaviors and those deviations from typical patterns that are indicative of it being an unusual email. The other challenge here, as we'll see in this first example, is oftentimes because another thought might be, well, attackers are going to use what is likely a malicious domain. Well, firstly, a lot of the time, what we'll see is attackers will register a new domain, a lookalike domain, let it bake for a few weeks or months so that it appears legitimate. They'll spoof email authentication so it passes SPF, DKIM, and DMARC checks, and it looks, by all accounts, like a legitimate domain from a legitimate sender. But even more insidious, in this example here, they might just show up in an existing thread from a known vendor. So in this case, this is an attack where a vendor was compromised and the attacker was able to inject themselves directly into that thread. So because it was coming from a legitimate vendor inbox, it passed all authentication checks. It appeared, again, within a real thread. So it already had that level of credibility and trust and authenticity. So there was no real way to be able to detect that this was a threat in any other way besides seeing some of those subtle cues, which is why we were able to detect it. The result, of course, here being that the attacker was asking for payment be made to this new Bank of America account. So it ends up in a loss of, financial loss for the organization. The second attack that I'll show you is a much less, well, I want to say much less sophisticated. It's still a very sophisticated attack in that it appears as legitimate as it possibly can, but this isn't injected in the middle of a thread. This is one that can be used at scale, right? It's much less targeted, I guess is the right way to describe it, while being no less legitimate looking in terms of the email itself. But in this attack, the attacker was able to generate a professional, grammatically accurate, syntactically accurate email that was asking for the recipient to update their banking information. And it's coming from a credit and collection specialist, so that already creates a sense of urgency. If you send this out to enough people at scale, it's going to look like one, a legitimate email, and two, target a lot of victims all at once with something that's hard to determine is a threat. And again, why it succeeded here is the language looks natural. It doesn't come across as intimidating. It doesn't really raise any suspicions because, as you can see in that second bullet there, it's non-urgent, right? This isn't something that is trying to intimidate the user into sending money. It looks like a friendly email saying that an account needs to be updated. So again, the result here is in follow-up emails. Because once you've built that trust, or an attacker rather has built that trust with that initial send, follow-up emails are now going to guide that user to send information or send money to that attacker's bank account, or maybe even harvest credentials by sending malicious links now that that user trusts the sender from that initial social engineering message. Now, those are a few examples, but I want to show you how we would succeed in detecting these sorts of attacks. So if I go into my demo environment, because that's why you're all here anyway, let me stop sharing and I will pull up my demo quickly. So if I go into my demo environment, I'm going to take this one. Everything in our demo environment is a real attack that we have just obviously anonymized, but it's based on something that we have actually detected. So this example here is pretty textbook business email compromise as well. So you can see, first off, we were able to determine with extreme certainty that this was a threat because they had an unusual sender domain, and a suspicious financial request. There was no attachment. There was no link. But what we can look at here is a text analysis of the email itself, right? So we can say maybe Mick and Jonathan know each other, right? Maybe Jonathan typically receives emails from Mick. But even if they have, what we know about their communications is that Jonathan doesn't typically speak, as you can see here, with a neutral formality. You can see that some of it is formal, some of it is informal. So there's a mismatch in tone here. Even further, if he was entirely formal and is typically more casual, that's something we would be able to detect as well. There's an unusual sense of urgency, typically indicative of a threat. It's a payment request and a financial request, which obviously are going to raise suspicions already when that's held in concert with other, as you can see here, 43,000 potentially unusual behavioral signals. But in this case, maybe Mick and Jonathan don't typically talk about payment information, and that's obviously going to raise red flags as well. But if we go further, we can also see the sender identity analysis. In this case, Citron Finance, rather than Citron Finance, passes sender authentication checks. It passes SPF, DKIM, DMARC. But even so, we're able to say that this is a mismatch. This is an unknown identity. Mick has never sent from this address before, even if it appears to be a legitimate domain. And typically we will go even further and do, it's not in this example, unfortunately, but we will do, I'll show you some of the other vectors though, while we're in here. We will do a social graphing as well to analyze and understand if these two typically communicate, when they communicate, how they communicate. And you could see some of that surface through the content analysis as well. But some of the other vectors here you can see are identity analysis, behavioral analysis, header analysis, communication patterns, content. Well, in this case, there's no payload, but it's still something we would analyze in the case of other emails: federated, authentication verification, business context analysis, and threat intel analysis. If we look at some other examples here, and we go to another one that was business email compromise, so we go to this email here, you can see again a high level of certainty of potential payroll fraud from an unusual sender, a suspicious financial request. And again, in this case, there's no attachment, there's no link, but it's a pretty simple single line email that they want to change their direct deposit information before payroll is next completed. But it's coming from a Gmail, so that's already going to raise flags. But if we go a bit further and we look at the text analysis again, we can see that first off, there's an informal tone here. It's an urgent email. Again, it's requesting financial information, already kind of raising some level of suspicion, but nothing particularly damaging, as you can see by the color, the color labeling. But then again, we can do the sender analysis. This is an unknown email. Certainly, it's a Gmail. It could be that sender's typical Gmail address, but based on what we understand about this user, we've never seen this sent before from, or this sender send this email from this Gmail, even if it passes authentication checks, which obviously it will, as a Gmail address. And you can see the analysis that's done here as well. And you can see that we mentioned it exhibits suspicious sending behavior. And again, we go across all of these different vectors to make this determination of whether or not this is a threat. Now, beyond that, I'll also note that if a vendor sends a malicious email, we will detect that and put that into a larger profile we're creating for any of the vendors that you typically communicate with. So we'll know in the future, or actually, uh, 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 well, lost my train of thought. We will understand in the future if, and have a higher level of scrutiny about that vendor if we've received one malicious email from them. And then obviously you can go and notify that vendor that they've been potentially compromised. I'll look at one more example because I know we're only about 11 minutes in here, so we can honestly go through a few of these. And you can see this one's part of a campaign. So if we go in here, we found a couple of emails that came from this sender. And you can see here we did an identity analysis that indicated possible account compromise in the first place. So that obviously is going to raise some red flags. We have a suspicious mail filter that was created, which is typically indicative of account compromise, sent from a never before seen vendor. And again, suspicious financial requests. Suspicious financial requests in general are obviously going to raise red flags, and any financial request should be handled with a higher level of scrutiny. So in this case, you can see this one has a link, but the link here is a link to enterprise.com. But you can also see this one had attachments. So we'll take a look at that as well. But the idea here is this is again seen as business email compromise. And it was sent by Renee to Zachary and Josh. They've approved a wire transfer and should be prepared for immediate release. If we do a text analysis, again, it's just one line. It's urgent and it's a financial request. Already starting off with some behavior that's typically linked to a malicious email. Now, if we go through and we look at these domains, you can see that there's again, it's a suspicious financial request. The domains appear legitimate, but if we do an attachment analysis here, again, the attachments also appear legitimate. And what's important about this is if this was something that was being analyzed by a gateway or traditional methods, all of these appear legitimate, so they're not going to raise red flags because there are no known IOCs. But once again, we're going to look at the sender identity analysis. And yes, this is a known employee, but this employee has now been compromised, right? They're sending from a never before seen location and sending from a never before seen IP address. So this is actually internal to internal compromise as well. Again, obviously passes authentication checks. And you can see there's a weak relationship between Renee and Josh. They don't typically communicate. Now, while Renee and the recipient company, obviously being an internal email, is strong, the fact that there's a weak relationship between the recipient of this email and the sender is also going to be held in concert with these other signals to determine that this is a threat. Now, if we take it a step further, we can go ahead and we can look at Renee and we can see what that compromise was. You can see there was impossible travel between San Francisco and Hong Kong because, as far as I know, there isn't a 1.5 hour flight between San Francisco and Hong Kong. So we can see that that lateral email was actually added to an ongoing case that we were analyzing about Renee already to determine that she was compromised. So that then goes into the analysis of whether or not this email was a malicious email as well. So with all of that, we'll do one more. I like showing the demo, and I hope this has been enjoyable for all of you as I'm going through it. So the next one that I want to show here is this payment status. So if we look at this one here, you can see, again, possible vendor compromise in this case, a reply to change and suspicious financial request. Again, a pretty high level of certainty that this is truly a threat. You can see the vendor risk is already high. Maybe this vendor has been previously compromised, so we're already going to be scrutinizing this email with an extra level of concern. There was an attachment here that we'll take a look at in a second. And then we do the text analysis, a lot of red flags raised. You can see the formal tone and the sense of urgency. Again, a bit unusual. Financial request already going to be analyzed with a little more scrutiny. And if we do the attachment analysis, well, it looks like it could be another legitimate attachment here. It's just a PDF. We can look at it. Looks like a legitimate PDF to me. But then when we go in here, we can see it's an unknown identity from Prolia Systems. This is not a URL that we've seen from, or a URL, a domain that we've seen from them before. You can see that the sender geolocation was never before seen for this vendor, nor was the IP address. So even though it passes authentication checks, that is going to raise immediate red flags, especially when coupled with it being a financial email. And finally, a weak relationship exists. Of course it does. This is someone that we've never seen before in terms of the identity, but it's still worth knowing that a weak relationship exists between Lucia and Renee and Lucia and the organization itself. So again, that's going to go into that file for that vendor, and we're going to be able to detect these potential social engineering attacks in the future coming from this source. So with that, I'm going to open it up to, actually, before I open it up to questions, I do want to do a little bit of housekeeping here at the end. I'll go back to questions in a second, but I also want to note for all the folks that are on, before I totally forget to do that while we get into the questions, we do have, this is an ongoing series, these ThreatStream webinars. So we do have two coming up on November 14th. We'll be talking about cryptocurrency fraud with Mike Morton, fast money, faster scams. And then Abby, another product marketer from my team, will be talking about Microsoft 365 misconfigurations and how those can create vulnerabilities. That's in line with our security posture management capabilities and the need to fortify the Microsoft 365 platform. I'll be on December 16th, so definitely sign up for those if you haven't, but let's go back and take some questions.
Hey Ryan, it looks like there is one question here in the chat. How would an abnormal customer be notified if a vendor has been compromised?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It dovetails with what I was showing about vendor compromise there. So if I go in, I'll go back into the demo environment and show that because I think it's good to show here. So if we go in here, what I didn't click into is vendor base. Now that I think about it. So Prolia Systems, which I know I showed in that example, what we'll do with Prolia Systems is let's say that an attack was never received from Renee or Becker Group or Stan or any vendors you work with out there. But some of our other customers have received malicious emails from those vendors. We're going to now put that in vendor base. So you'll see, oh, we work with Prolia Systems. We've never received a malicious email, but malicious emails have been seen elsewhere. Obviously, we won't tell you what customers those were, but we use that federated intelligence to raise the risk level of that vendor for all of our customers that typically communicate with them. So that's going to add another layer of protection in that case, because if we know vendor A has been compromised with customer B and you're customer A, well, we know when that vendor emails you that we should be looking with an extra level of attention to make sure that, you know, they're not now making you part of that threat campaign. Any other questions? And I'll admit, I didn't anticipate too many because I do know that business email compromise has, again, been an ongoing threat for some time. Definitely one that I think is pretty well known, definitely news making. But if you have any other questions on how we detect them, I know I gave quite a few examples, or anything else you'd like to know, I'm here to answer. Oh, let's see what we got.
Here it says,
Oh yeah, I see.
where, oh, okay.
Oh, sorry. Oh yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, I just saw it in the chat too. Yeah, so the vendor risk does come from our own intelligence. So that is based on what we understand across our customer base, right? So, like I had mentioned, if we see that one particular vendor has been compromised and is sending malicious emails to one or a group of our customers, but you work with that vendor and you've never received those malicious emails, you'll still see that increased risk level based on what we're seeing in, you know, our 4,000 customers. Jesus, was there anything you wanted to add to that? And you're on mute if you're
Sorry, no. Yeah,
okay.
no. Yeah, I was just gonna read it out loud so that they know. The question was, where does the vendor risk you showed come from? Does that come from Abnormal's own threat intelligence attacks detected for other customers? And yeah, it's just like Ryan highlighted within the vendor base, it is a federated database that is intelligence shared across Abnormal customers. for abnormal customers. And whenever compromise is detected within the abnormal community, that intelligence is then spread out to other abnormal customers that may also be doing business with that trusted vendor within your community. And I think that was the last one, Ryan.
I think so too. Yeah. Well, I'm going to take that as a sign that I answered everything everyone could possibly think to ask. But either way, if there are no other questions, I appreciate everyone hopping onto this session. Like I had mentioned, if you haven't, um, and if you want to see these again, please sign up for these other sessions. They will all include information from our threat intelligence team. All these slides come directly from our threat intelligence team, the attacks that we are seeing out there. We definitely want to make sure that you are in the loop and we can show you what Abnormal can do to protect against them as well. So with that, I appreciate everyone joining today and have a fantastic weekend.